Good morning, Mid-Canterbury, and we're coming to you this morning from the council. We've got Hamish with me, and we just want to have a chat about the three waters. And the three waters are stormwater, wastewater and drinking water. Three very important waters in our district, and there's a reform going on at the moment, and the government is wanting to set up 4 entities in New Zealand. And in our district, they'd like to set up one entity which is the bulk of the South Island, all except the top of the South Island, which would go up to North Island. So we're looking at one entity here, and there's a lot of information out there at the moment, and all our information's gone away to this body in Scotland, I think it was, and they've looked at it all and come back and said, if we opt into the three waters, then our waters in 2050, what we pay for them, will be about $1,500 in today's terms. And if we don't opt into them, in 2050, we'll be paying something like $8,000 and $9,000 in today's terms.
Yeah.
So we're just trying to get our head around that as councillors.
Yeah.
And we're setting up a workshop where you're going to explain all that to us and see how that figures have been arrived at.
Yeah, and it's really complicated. The DIA Three Waters website has got all this information on it, so there's no secret squirrel stuff, but it is complicated and not easy to understand. But essentially, I think the desire for clean water is widely held in New Zealand. So no one's arguing that we shouldn't have clean water across the Three Waters network. Councils across New Zealand know they have to invest more, and there are anecdotal examples, from time to time in New Zealand around improvements that need to be made. And in fact, my understanding across New Zealand, Neil, is that in the recent long-term plans that councils have done, that there is something like a doubling of the money that councils are planning to spend on the Three Waters network over the next 10 years. So I think there's an acceptance that the community deserves clean water, and I think there is an acceptance that more needs to be done. But it's then how. So is this the reform the right way to do it? Is staying on our own and investing more, or is there other alternatives? And the data that the reform proposal is highlighting, which, as you say, does come from the Water Industry Commission in Scotland, all the analysis they did, indicates that the new entities will provide cheaper water in the future than if councils were to stay on their own. But how they get to that conclusion, the numbers themselves, that's for us to try and work through with councillors in the coming weeks. Yeah,
and we'll do that. I think our workshops in the weeks coming up, and there'll be lots of questions come out of that.
Yeah.
And that they call this the 8-week period for us to have those workshops, get those questions out, and send those questions back to the DIA in Wellington for answers. And there's a lot of myths out there at the moment, and one of them is around the governance or the ownership. Hamish, could you just tell us a wee bit about what you know there?
Yeah, well, one of the features of the reform, Neil, is that the governance of the new entities is 50-50 with mana whenua, so with the iwi of the land. And that's been portrayed in some circles as iwi ownership of the assets, and that isn't true. So councils continue to own the assets, all the water assets, but the overarching governance of the entity is 50-50 with mana whenua. So not ownership, just co-governance.
Yep. One of the concerns I'm hearing out there, Hamish, is privatisation, and it could be sold off to an entity overseas somewhere, and they come in and control our water forever, which we don't want.
No.
So we need to safeguard that. So are the government thinking of measures putting in place to safeguard that for us?
Yes, they are. So this government is very aware of that concern, is completely opposed to privatisation of these water assets. There's two strong mechanisms. One is the co-governance with iwi Māori. Their view is also not to have these assets privatised, and it's just another layer of complexity. If in the future someone wanted to, you've now got further work to do to try and convince the decision makers that privatisation will be good. So that'll help. And there's also a really high threshold, 75% support from the community before you can contemplate a privatisation proposal. So they're building in a couple of really quite quite strong mechanisms. So it's not this government's intention, it's not this council's intention that these reforms will speed up or lead to privatisation.
And it's not iwi's intention
and it's
either.
certainly not iwi's either.
Certainly
So there's the future's a long way away, isn't it? But these mechanisms, these reforms, if you like, are not aimed at making it easier in the future. They will make it really hard.
How do you think we can get the public to come on this journey with us? How are we going to give them information?
Well, and hear back, isn't it?
We need feedback from them as well.
That's right. One of the things that, again, it's another myth, Neil, around the current 8-week period, is that at the end of this 8 weeks, councils like ours and across New Zealand have to decide whether or not we're in or out. And that's not what this 8-week period is for. So it's not about coming to a conclusion around whether we should opt out or not. It's about learning as much about the reforms as we can, and those matters that aren't clear to us or that we have concerns about are fed back to DIA at the end of the 8-week period. What we think once we've got council up to speed with the detail, then we might produce some sort of document that expresses where council's got to and the issues that are important and are of concern or not clear, and then make that public and ask our community to comment on that. Is it expressing, the right questions? But not, are we opting in or out? Because that decision's not being taken by the end of September. It's not what we're being asked to do. So it's more about the understanding the detail.
And that question will be answered in or out by the latter part of this year.
Well, we think so. Yes. The government has made it clear that once they get council's feedback by the end of September, then they will then advise next steps in the reform process. So It's not yet clear what that will be. But we would expect some further information after September.
And another reason we're doing all this is because the standards are changing. They're getting tougher. Because we all need clean drinking water, and our wastewater needs to be disposed of in the right place, keep it out of our rivers, etc. So that's one of the reasons that this reform is happening.
Yeah, that's right. And the councils across New Zealand are responding to that, with the increased investment that we talked about. But is it enough? Is it happening quick enough? If the standards continue to rise, perhaps particularly in wastewater, how will councils be able to afford to keep up with the standards? And are these big entities more likely to provide the vehicle for economic viability?
And for those people at home who want to do some research of their own, they can go onto the DIA's website, Department of Internal Affairs website, and there's a lot of information on there, which is the same information we given, a lot of information, and you can trawl through that yourselves if you want to.
That's right, Neil. It's all there. It's I've heard again, discussed about secret squirrel and behind closed doors, and it's not true. That all the information is there. It's just a bit hard to understand, and that's what we're obviously helping council with. One of the other matters that's complicated in this reform proposal is the manner in which the community gets to have a say, or at the moment, of course, they elect councillors and the mayor. If there's issues around waters that they don't like or they want, they got a very direct voice with councillors. These new entities are going to be big. They're not going to have elected board of directors. So how does the community voice, how does council express the community's concerns to these big entities? And that's a matter I'm sure council is going to chew through and will be part of the feedback that we give DIA. How can we have our cake and eat it? If they're going to be big and they're going to deliver these economic benefits, how does the community stay connected to these big entities?
Yeah, that's a big concern out there, is how do we get representation? How does little old Ashburton get representation on a big South Island-wide water body? And that'll be a question we'll have for them, amongst many others. So,
yes, that's right.
Hamish, the government's announced $2.5 billion for Tranche 2 monies, and for Ashburton that means about $16.8 million. And sounds like a windfall for us. But there will be fish hooks with it, no doubt. So what can we spend that money on if it gets to that stage of getting it?
Yeah, so the government's intention with that money is to ensure no council, no community is worse off if the Three Waters is taken out of council's operation. So that's the payment to reflect that. So in our case, 16.8 million. It's to be spent around community wellbeing, resilience, climate change, housing pressures. So the sorts of things that New Zealanders are talking about up and down the country, the sorts of matters that are important to communities around wellbeing and resilience in the community. So that's sort of how it's generally tagged, but it isn't tagged to the water assets this time. It's tagged to a more broader wellbeing, resilience program.
Yeah, thanks for that, Hamish. So in the next couple of weeks, we're going to have that workshop, and you're going to give us that information. We're going to chew it through. Questions will go off to the DIA in Wellington, and if people want more information themselves, they go to that DIA's website and gather information there too. So thanks very much for listening in, and we'll see you next time.